Hi everyone, welcome to the latest of our Urgent Conversations webinars. We look at some of the most urgent and some of the most interesting questions around waste and resources and how we can get more recycling, repair and other circular activities into more prominence. Really looking forward to today's session on recycling innovations, and we have a really great panel lined up. We have, first off, from Resource Futures, our policy lead Susan Evans, and she's going to be joined by Jim Brown from Optimum Eco Group, and also Charlotte Stamper from the Circularity Collective. We were going to be joined by Derek Wiseman from DECMAR, but unfortunately he's not able to make it. In his place, we have Holly Owens, who is a consultant at Resource Futures, who's going to be stepping in to talk to us all about marine plastics and fishing gear. Welcome to everybody. We're going to be running this as a series of, we're going to run these as a series of interviews and then go into a wider conversation. I'm going to hand over to Susan, who's going to introduce us to the topic and start the conversation. So over to you, Susan.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming along and thanks to our speakers for joining today. So just to introduce who we are, first of all, we're Resource Futures. We focus on circular economy and sustainable waste management, and I'm the policy lead. So in the policy area, we support governments to develop circular economy, recycling and waste management policies, and we also help others to sort of develop evidence-based criticisms of those same policies and also come up with ideas for better policies in the future. And it's quite an exciting time at the moment, as I'm sure lots of you are aware, in the recycling and circular economy policy area, because we're finally getting to the point where I think we're moving ahead, implementing some of those long-awaited recycling policies, and governments are starting to look across the UK at what's coming next, the kind of next generation of circular economy policies. So it's early days, but we have just seen a consultation come out in Scotland on a new circular economy strategy. We're waiting for England's circular economy strategy from their circular economy task force as well. And in Wales, there's been a sort of beyond recycling strategy in place for a while. So it's exciting that people are starting to look beyond the kind of basics, because I think for quite a long time, recycling policy and what has been referred to as circular economy policy has tended to look at the sort of lowest common denominator in the recycling world. So just getting those basic statistics on what percent of recycling are we achieving, across the sector, across the material, across the whole economy. Whereas actually when you start to visit places that are doing different types of recycling, repair, reuse, these kinds of activities, you see there's like a massive difference between doing the most basic form of recycling and doing higher quality types of recycling that really recover more value, get more things back into use at higher value into the circular economy. And my feeling, having worked on circular economy policy for a while, is we really need to be doing a lot more in policy terms to incentivize those higher value activities, bare minimum to differentiate between reuse and recycling in our targets, but also think about the different quality of recycling outcome. And so in the past year or so, I've been lucky enough, along with some of my team members, to visit various facilities doing this sort of more advanced recycling and reuse, including Optimum Eco's facility where Jim Brown works, and the European Metals Recycling facility on wind turbine recycling and reuse, which Charlotte Stamper was running a project in, and also up in Peterhead in the far north of Scotland, visiting DECMAR's fishing gear recycling facility. So what we're going to do just now is I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn to just give a brief introduction to the kind of what they've been doing in the world of recycling innovation, really trying to push those boundaries and do things that perhaps haven't been done that much before, or improve practices to redefine what best practice is. And then we're going to go through some of the challenges and the barriers, but also the opportunities that they've encountered along the way, and look for the kind of commonalities and differences. So that's how the conversation is going to go. Ben, if you'd like to bring in the first speaker back onto the screen. So Charlotte, thanks for joining today. And I'd like to give you just a couple of minutes, first of all, just to kind of talk in general about introduce yourself and the project that you're working on wind turbine recycling, and perhaps what you're still doing to push ahead sort of innovation in this area.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Charlotte Stamper. I'm a member of the Circularity Collective. We are a coalition of freelance researchers bound together by a shared mission for an inclusive and sustainable circular economy. So that's what I do now. This afternoon, I'm going to talk a little bit about my previous experience. As Susan mentioned, my previous role was working for European Metal Recycling, where I was heading up their renewables decommissioning efforts. And in the broadest sense, my professional experience over the last 5 or 6 years has been really focused on looking at what happens to renewables, specifically wind turbines, when they reach the end of their usable life. And how can we improve the outcomes for the components and materials in those assets? So, as Susan already mentioned, trying to move away from this baseline recycling to something that moves up the waste hierarchy and actually achieves a greater material recovery and also lots of positive co-benefits alongside that. So yeah, we are sharing some experiences not only from my world, but there are plenty of other excellent companies in this field who are really now in the UK coming together to start to deliver this on a much bigger scale as we move towards the first wave of wind turbine decommissioning. But I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
What is the kind of baseline of recycling in that wind turbine sector, and what are the areas that you've been involved in to try and go beyond that, just in brief?
Yeah, I suppose, the overall context is that, we have a lot of wind turbines in the UK, globally. And the first ones that were installed are now starting to come towards the end of their usable life. A typical design life of a wind turbine is around 25 years. You can push that out to 30, 35. They're just like cars. If you maintain them well, you can run them for longer. The wind turbine is around 80 to 90% metal. Most of that is steel. There's some aluminium and copper in there. 10% by weight is fiberglass, and the blades, they're a bit of a special case. But if we just focus on the 80 to 90% that's metal, scrap metal is very efficiently collected and recycled already, and wind turbines are absolutely no exception to that. They're the same as a building that gets demolished or a car that comes to the end of its life. One of the issues is that recycling in this form is often downcycling. Metals are all different qualities and purities, and the scrap metal industry globally, the market economics dictate that usually they're aggregated together. So all different types of steels will usually be aggregated together. And at every stage of the recycling process, you lose energy. And often, like I said, the quality of the materials actually decreases. And in the UK, we're one of the top 5 countries in the world who export most of their metals. So not only are we losing that from an efficiency standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, we are exporting a lot of the value held in those materials. So for that reason, yes, there's a big tick already in the recycling box for most of what happens to wind turbines. But people who own wind turbines, people who are interested in their development, like local communities, quite rightly starting to ask questions of how can we do better than that?
Yeah. And when you say what rough percentages of metal and what are fiberglass and other materials, I assume you're talking by weight, because some of those lighter materials are actually quite big, bulky
That's right.
things.
Yeah, I think that's
problematic,
that's just an artifact of me existing in the waste industry for so long. Yeah, by weight. Actually, if we look at it by another factor that's driving behaviour that maybe we can get into further on in the conversation is the cost of the value recovery from an asset like that. So by weight, rule of thumb, 90% metal, 10% fiberglass. If we're talking about cost value recovery, those figures would look very, very different. So yeah, different drivers for different materials.
And with the project you were doing, so you were looking at different ways of sort of recycling things, but also reusing different components and that kind of thing. Can you talk a bit more about that? And also, what was the original kind of motivation for that particular project getting going?
Yeah, so the project I worked on, EMR, who are still running that project very successfully in Glasgow, we're starting to take apart wind turbines as they came to the end of their life and try and understand, is there a reuse potential for this? So again, a bit like cars, some wind turbines can have a very efficient and long second life in their entirety. So there is a very healthy second-hand wind turbine market. If a wind turbine reaches the point where that's not possible, there's potential to recover individual components and refurbish those. So, for example, a generator or a gearbox can be reconditioned and remanufactured to the point it can have another life in a different, newer wind turbine sometimes. So we were exploring that. I think The driver, I'm happy to say, was a lot of it is coming from the developers and the people that own wind turbines. Some of that's from a CSR and community engagement perspective. Some of it is from a value perspective. Decommissioning is expensive. So anything you can do to offset the cost of decommissioning by recovering more value from your materials or components is going to be welcomed. So in a happy sense, the sort of sustainability and ethics is actually trying to align that with the economics, which is often where you get the best success stories.
Interesting. And it's interesting to think that if we could kind of come up with something like a better way of approaching this somewhere like Scotland, where we do a lot of wind power and a lot more is planned, obviously, in the coming decades, the sort of impact that could have in changing practices globally, isn't it?
Yeah, and the UK is not the only country looking at this. I mean, Germany and Denmark have already undergone much more decommissioning and onshore wind than we already have, and so they're a little bit more advanced than us. There are obviously different policy drivers in different territories, and also the US actually is starting to undergo its own transition from the first generation to the second generation. Environmental outlook and economic outlook is quite different to ours in some cases, so yeah, different behaviours.
This was essentially an R&D project, as I understand. So how did the funding work for that? Like, what did it take to get this project off the ground in practice?
Yeah, it was certainly underpinned by an innovation grant. But I should say that EMR is a family-owned business, and the family is investing on a generational timescales, quite different potentially to shareholder-owned business. And, you know, that I was very fortunate to be in that context because this wind turbine activity is going to be an activity that actually probably doesn't get commercially viable in a big sense, and you know, maybe until the days, but the innovation and the investment has to start now. We did have an innovation grant from Innovate UK that helped us look at some of these more innovative aspects, and that was actually focused on critical raw material recovery. Some types of wind turbines have rare earth element magnets in them, and we know as an industry very little about how to successfully recover and recycle those materials. Some of the equipment and the actual facility was funded by that grant, but it is also, there are commercial projects happening. So we were carrying out, like I said, projects without funding in parallel at the same time.
Oh, that's interesting. So there were a range of different funding sources all coming in. And do you think is it an area where you're seeing increasing interest in investing in these types of projects and potentially also to scale up these sorts of activities?
Yeah, I think, like I said, there are lots of interesting, successful, innovative businesses starting to look at circularity in wind, particularly onshore wind. I think the challenge collectively for that industry is that the outlook is still a little uncertain, and the point where a wind turbine reaches the end of life is often not a technical reason. It's not that it's fallen over or stopped working. It's usually due to perhaps the ending of a subsidy or a particular policy lever or an economic tipping point. And those things can shift over time. They can shift quite quickly. So it's very difficult for the industry to say, well, next year we'll definitely have 10 big wind farms that are decommissioned, because if something changes in that landscape, those projects might get pushed out another 5 years. So the challenge is the industry, when's the right time to invest and scale up? It's not alone in that. I mean, if you look at the oil and gas decommissioning industry, they've faced very similar challenges because no one really wants to do decommissioning. To be honest, it's difficult and it costs money. Operating in that kind of investment landscape can be difficult. And I think that's why things like the innovation funding are actually incredibly helpful when you're just starting out to try and explore this. They actually give a little bit of an anchor for companies to develop.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, because investor certainty, you see that across other areas of recycling, don't you, in different sectors as well. That kind of question of the long-term direction always comes up. Okay, and in terms of like your experience at EMR, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced that you had to overcome?
Yeah, I think, again, probably the biggest challenge is not unique to what I was doing at EMR. I know others in the industry, and that is that actually the prevailing business model does work quite well. By that, I mean that the scrapping of something that has a lot of metal in it is a very established industry. it provides value return for the asset owner. So just like you or I could walk into a scrapyard with an old radiator and get paid for it, the same is true of someone who owns a wind turbine. And that's a relatively quick cash flow process as well. You are guaranteed to be compensated for your material, and you can, every town has a scrapyard. So that's the prevailing model. It's low risk, it's understood, it works fairly well because the material does get recycled in some capacity. When you're trying to challenge that with a different business model, which is saying, well, instead of scrapping this item, let's try and understand if it has a reuse value. That may entail things like inspections, the sharing of data, may take a long time. So you might be someone has to have that component or asset on their books as a risk. And in that time, commodity prices are changing as well. So the two conflicting business models are one's very well understood. It has an okay environmental outcome and everyone gets value from it. To challenge that with something that's more unknown, potentially has a higher reward, but it's not guaranteed and also takes a lot longer. That's the difficulty, and the policy is not pointing you in one or the other direction. At the moment, it's ultimately a business decision. So obviously, route A, the established business model, does still look quite good from a pure business standpoint. And I think maybe that's where we could do with a bit more support, is to actually help point people in the direction of that alternative business model.
Yeah, and it would be good to hear your thoughts on what would help in that sense. But I suppose one question is around the alternative that you're offering potentially recovers some of those items and components at higher value. So can you just sort of explain why it is that when you're recovering things that are of higher value fundamentally than sort of scrap steel, why that is so hard? I assume it's to do with the end markets and actually the demand for those.
That's right. I mean, something only has a value if someone's prepared to pay that. And in theory, you might have a nice gearbox that is in theory worth 40,000 euros, but only if someone needs it. And connecting with that end market's difficult. There are certain aspects of reusing components in critical infrastructure that aren't very well defined. Things like insurance risk, for example. If you put a reconditioned asset into a wind turbine, there's potentially, or it's the perception is that's a greater risk. Although you can mitigate that with things like warranties, it's still relatively not very well understood or characterized from a business risk perspective. So it comes back to, if you had an item, someone said, I'll give you £100 for it today, or you can wait 6 months. I might give you £10,000 for it, but I might not. Which would you take?
I might be the wrong person to ask that question to. But that's interesting. And that point about risk perception, like you've said, the risk perception of the sort of refurbished item, for example. I mean, I know from speaking to people in the electronics sector, for example, that often that's completely false, that we're actually like a refurbished item may have had more thorough checks than a new item where you just have occasional spot checks on a production line. So actually the failure rate for refurbished items in some sectors is actually lower. Is there something comparable? Is it just a matter of perception as well in the wind sector?
I think the actual challenge is as much as the technology is evolving. So it's not necessarily that the part is more or less reliable. It's just that we're not running those wind turbines anymore. So if we're recovering parts from a 25-year-old wind turbine, they're not going to work in the new wind turbines, like everything, like phones, computers, cars. Things have moved on. So the challenge is connecting that end market, who is still running that older wind turbine, who will have a use for it, and how long do they want to use it for. It is possible, but it's very difficult. It's not something that can be done at the moment necessarily off the shelf, like, a wind eBay, because it's quite a lot more complicated than that. It is possible, but I think, as I've said, the main thing is someone has to bear a risk in that process, because whilst you're undergoing that matchmaking exercise, who owns the asset or the component? Is it the owner? Is there a third party in the middle? Is it the person buying it? There's costs associated with storage. If you're exporting it, all of the, the troubles and red tape that come with actually exporting something, that has to be done by someone. And at the moment, that is not a terribly established business. And the value that someone would generate from doing that is still quite difficult to prove.
So what do you think would help, whether that's policy support or or something else? It could be sort of, collaboration with the industry or any other sort of ideas that you have based on what you've learned.
Yeah, I mean, I think that largely the success stories I've seen have come from developers or asset owners who genuinely want to do this, and also supply chain companies who are doing this already, actually, and don't call it circular economy. This is just their day-to-day business. So that this is happening, and there are some success stories. I think change will naturally happen as the industry grows. It's quite difficult to do this when you have so few projects and so little certainty. One of the biggest things that could help is, I think, data sharing and benchmarking is still, all of this is still really unknown, both from a government and client perspective. What's the value in doing this, both to the asset owner, but also to the economy? I think that we're still working that out. I'd be a little nervous of prescribing specific policy measures because if you prescribe a policy measure when the industry is not ready for it, it's easy to have kind of unintended consequences. Maybe I would say that as someone who sat in the industry position. So yeah, I think that I'm certainly happy to talk more on the policy point. There are some specific things, but I think that some of this, like I say, will be driven by the economics of the situation.
Yeah, and I suppose, I'm sure that in the course of this conversation with yourself and the others, we'll probably talk a bit about design of the products.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose it's interesting to reflect that compared to, say, the gym sector with sort of smaller electronics and things like that, we're talking about wind turbines with massive, not just components, but also lifespans. So that the journey from design to when it's being taken apart, potentially at end of first life, it sort of introduces different dynamics of sort of the idea of an eco-design policy, doesn't it?
Definitely, yeah. Trying to recover useful value from something that's been operating outside for 30 years. Yeah, definitely there'll always be challenges with that. Also, human nature. It's quite hard to think about what you're going to do with something in 30 or 40 years' time. We're intrinsically not very good at doing that. So, for sure.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. I am going to ask you later on what advice you have for people in other sectors potentially who are looking to kind of get involved in this sorts of innovative projects to push recycling and reuse to sort of into new areas. But I'll let you think about that while the others speak, and then we'll come back and talk about that all together at the end.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Great. Now, welcome to Jim Brown from Optimum Eco. So, but first of all, please go ahead, introduce yourself and what you do at Optimum Eco, and in particular, how you've been involved in sort of innovations in recycling techniques.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be part of this discussion panel this afternoon. My name is Jim Brown. I'm a director at Optimum Eco Group. Optimum Eco Group encompasses two businesses, CCL North and Restructa Limited, both based in Scotland. We're based in Irvine. And we specialise in the reuse, repair and recycling of a whole variety of electronic and electrical equipment, from IT equipment, small domestic appliances, sort of your general waste electronic and electrical equipment, display equipment, so TVs, monitors, digital display units, that sort of thing. We also recycle vapes, and we've been doing that since about 2000. And our business is very much modelled around trying to maximise the potential of the assets that come into us in the business. And I kind of describe it as the circular economy in action, really. We've been operating for 25 years. CCL North is 25 years old this year, and Restructa is 20 years old this year. So we've been in the industry, in the business for a long, long time. And we were probably doing circular things before the circular economy was a term, really, just because I think there was a recognition that, there was lots that we could do with some of the materials that we get in, and there was reuse potential, and there is reuse potential. So, it's very much what drives the business, and we're always looking at innovation and how we can do things better. And without getting into too much detail at this stage, I can probably touch on a couple of the things that we've developed and innovated over the past few years, and that is the decorative glass aggregate that we developed from CRT recycling. So that's the old style cathode ray tube televisions. We use the glass from that to make a decorative aggregate for water features, for garden, for driveways, that sort of thing. And we've also developed a system and the technology to test for pops in TV plastics and the plastics that come from our display recycling process. The reason we innovated on that, the reason we got into that, was because overnight, in about, I think it was 2019, we basically received a letter from SEPA telling us that we could no longer recycle the plastics from the backs of TVs. So overnight we went from a revenue generation position to a very high cost disposal position via incineration. So we developed we went into partnership with University of West of Scotland, and they took on a PhD student, and I can talk about a wee bit more about that later on if you want. But again, just an example of some of the things we've innovated on, and how we've kind of turned it round a little bit, if you like.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I can sort of attest from my visit to your facilities, I was just impressed with the sort of obsession almost with finding a better use for every type of material, and that extended beyond even the electronics that came into some of the quite random items that you found yourselves with, and the packaging materials and everything. So it does seem like a team that's very creative and trying to come up with those sort of end uses.
Absolutely. Very much committed to that. And you're right, you mentioned the packaging, and one example of that is the kind of expanded polystyrene that we get in from in packaging with some of the sort of assets that we come in. It might be display units, TVs. We have a compaction. We've got a little sort of baler compactor on site that we brought in for that. All of that material, you could fill a 40-foot trailer with expanded polystyrene, and you would have maybe 200-300 kilos. So it makes it very, very, while it can be recycled, it makes it very, very inefficient to transport it for recycling. So we densify it and they palletize it, and we can then ship that off in substantial loads with a good payload, which makes that in itself much more economically viable, and there's a return for it as well. So it's again just we're always looking at ways to try and improve what we're doing and maximize the potential of the materials, even the packaging, as you say.
And that kind of problem solving approach it also extends to doing on-site repairs, doesn't it? So you talk a bit about like which items you're able to do significant amounts of repairs on, and how you kind of find end markets for those.
Yeah. So right through the business, reuse and repair is very much at the forefront of what we try and do. So to give you an example, on the TV and display side of things, we'll be bringing in TVs from all over Scotland and the UK, to be honest, into the facility. Instantly, what we are looking for, we try and educate people how to store them properly, first of all, because that's very, very important. If they're stored outside and they get wet, or if they're not stored properly and the screens get damaged, it makes it very, very difficult, almost impossible to reuse. So we start at the very beginning, and we educate people how to store them first and foremost. When we bring them in, we've got a small team of guys trained to test on sort of fit, form and function, and fault detection. It could just be a backlight on a TV that needs replaced. In many cases, there's not an awful lot wrong with the TV at all. It just needs desanitized, cleaned up, and it's, once it's been through the whole testing process, pack testing, etc., it's good to go. But so we do some small repairs. We keep a stock of items that we can repair TVs with, so that we might have taken out of old TVs that weren't suitable for reuse. Something similar to what Charlotte was referring to earlier on, actually, with regard to wind turbines, sort of mining the components and keeping a stock of them that we can then put in. So So on that side of the business, it's very, very, the important part is making sure we get the TVs in a decent state in the first place. Then we can perhaps do something with it. And for example, last year we were able to resell over 37,000 TVs, and that's TVs that people have just thrown out. There's nothing wrong with them, or very, very little wrong with them. But we've got the team there that are prepared to get in them and fix them and make them sellable, if you like.
But the fact that you do that in terms of the current producer responsibility legislation around electronics, that's not differentiated from the recycling target within those regulations. There's kind of a reuse and recycling requirements altogether, so you don't get any particular sort of policy acknowledgement for doing that. It's just kind of something that you do because is it because of economic reasons that you do it, or is it other reasons?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of economic reasons, but also, I think the whole kind of ethos of the business, and I'll touch on the IT side of things as well in a moment, but the whole ethos of the business is to try and get maximum potential out of the equipment that we bring in. So if it's working, or if it just needs a small repair, why wouldn't you try and do something with that and give it a second life? A lot of the time, I think it's something I might ask Charlotte later on, but I didn't realise there was a second-hand market for wind turbines. But the same applies to on the IT side of things. We have a refurb team, so we'll go through a whole process of triaging equipment and going through it and checking it. We always ask the customer, that's one of the first things we'll ask our client when we collect the equipment is, can we get permission to reuse it? Now, some customers will say no for various different reasons. It could be that they have, some concerns over security, or, data bearing equipment and stuff, which we can absolutely guarantee on anyway. We do secure data destruction and certification and all that. But some people, will have a particular angle on that maybe they don't want reuse, but we'll always ask. And if we do get reuse, we can put the kit, whether that be PCs or laptops or tablets, mobile phones, we'll put that through our triage system, where we'll again test for fit, form and function, and we're able then to remarket that. And it's not, obviously I just think it all round it's better, from a financial perspective. I dare say there's that again, it's back to what was discussed earlier. There is a second-hand market. Obviously the prices are much lower, so it's not really about, it's probably not, that's not the foremost thing, in terms of how we approach it, but it's certainly much more to do with the actual environmental and sustainability side of things.
Yeah. And when there's a specific project, like for example, I know that you have a facility for taking vapes apart that's quite sort of specific sort of area of your facility. For something like that, when you're trying to get some new equipment in place, maybe train up staff to do some, to handle something new like that that's potentially quite complex, has some hazardous elements, or equally when you're with the kind of POPs detection sort of project that you did, what are the typical options you'd look at to try and fund getting a project like that off the ground, doing that R&D, and then figuring out how to make it sustainable?
Well, I mean, so to touch on the POP side of things for a moment, when we, as I mentioned earlier, we brought a PhD student in, and that was through a KTP with University of West of Scotland, as I said. So that PhD student, working in conjunction with ourselves, developed a testing process based on XRF technology. And from there, we developed an app that enables us to scan the label of every TV monitor that came into the business. And we've built and developed a database of over 18,000 individual models that we have, on our system now. But in terms of funding, I mean, we funded that ourselves. We didn't receive any external funding for that. It was all internal. We actually funded that entirely on our own.
And I suppose that had a sort of motivation to avoid, as you said, the costs of disposal of that by other means, where you could have actually, because how much did you increase the recycling rate by compared to if you hadn't developed that technology, do you think?
So we are now back in a position where we'd gone from overnight, where we were recycling that plastic, the plastic TV backs, gone from a position where we were having to send off for incineration 100% of them, to now where we are back recycling over 75% of the TV casings. So yeah,
Huge
it was
difference, isn't it?
massive difference, absolutely massive difference. And that was the motivation. The motivation was, we need to find, this isn't right. We need to find a way to try and one, alleviate the cost, because it was a huge hit for us. But also to see if we could find a way to be able to recycle the TVs, the TV casings. So yeah, our motivation was definitely a lot to do with the costs that we were hit with to decide to go ahead, and it was a risk. It was a big risk to go and fund that. You're looking at circa £300,000 of funding that we had to find to put into that, but we decided it was the right thing to do as a business.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, you've sort of touched on policy very briefly, but what do you think is really needed to encourage this to become more widespread, to encourage more sort of electronics recycling businesses to really push the boundaries and go beyond the kind of lowest common denominator of how you could achieve sort of ticking that box that electronics have been recycled?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's got to be some sort of push to. You've seen our process; it's a very manual process. Both facilities, both at CCL North and at Restructor.
Yeah, it's probably useful actually to draw that comparison, isn't it? Like I did with Charlotte at the start. Kind of what's the kind of the baseline of what you could do if you just did the easiest type of recycling versus what you do, just sort of in brief.
Yeah, so yeah, very briefly, I mean, I think that there are much cheaper and much cruder ways to do what we do. I mean, some people out there will just shred. They'll just shred pretty much everything, and then once it's all mixed together, we'll try and use other bits of technology to try and separate it all out again, and then try and get some sort of recycling out of it. Whereas our process is very, very manual, and it is for a reason. We physically, manually, with all this SDA, the small domestic appliances that come through the facilities, we hand touch every single item. So we're looking at, taking cables off, we're checking for batteries. We all know the horror stories out there in the industry with vehicles going on fire, with lithium batteries in the back of trucks, or in a recycling centre where it's been run over by a lithium battery's run over by a telehandler or something. So we are hand touching every single item to check for all of that, but we're also at the same time looking for items that are coming through that side of the process that may be suitable for reuse. On the IT side of things, again, very, very much it's a very manual process. So we've got our team physically, manually taking apart systems with screwdrivers and drills and all sorts. So it's very, very hands-on. And the same in the refurb area when we're desanitizing equipment or we're doing small repairs. It's all done manually.
It totally changes what you can do with it at the end of the day, doesn't it?
It just gives you so many more options in terms of what you can do, So I think there has to be some sort of, whether you mandate that that's what has to happen, I don't know, but I'm not sure if that's the answer, but certainly.
So I think when you look at policy statements, whether that's at UK sort of like DEFRA level or whether at Scottish level and so on, it does seem to be that the policy statements all support the types of activities that you're doing, trying to prioritise reuse and repair and the higher quality of recycling, but at the moment it doesn't quite feed through, does it, as solid policy incentives, and something
no, I don't
need
think
to change
it does
going forward.
Yeah, I think there has to be a look at that. I mean, we work very closely with a lot of the producer compliance schemes out there. And they, they'll have a contract in place with whatever, local authorities, for example, throughout Scotland. But they're competing against other compliance schemes who to get these contracts. So they're then, as are, each of all of these schemes are coming to people like us and saying, what's your best price?
What's the best price? Yeah. So we need to look at, those kind of value chain wide economic incentives, basically, when designing policies. So Holly has bravely stepped in today. Holly and I have been working on a project recently, along with other colleagues, looking at fishing gear recycling, and both of us have visited the facility at DECMA. So I'm going to ask Holly to sort of answer a few questions about DECMA, just to give people a bit of context on that, as Derek wasn't able to join today, unfortunately, last minute. Okay, so Holly, do you want to just give a brief bit of context about what DECMA does?
Yeah. So as Susan said, we went to a site visit in Deckmar, which is up in Fraserburgh, which is conveniently close to Peterhead, which is one of the largest fishing ports in the UK. So Deckmar is a site that's basically there to reprocess fishing and aquaculture gear waste, specifically ropes. So these are a really challenging material to recycle and reprocess. Fishing gear itself is designed to capture fish. So breaking that down and treating that, putting that through machinery is quite challenging, because in some ways it's designed to try and capture the machine. So you have to break it down and do all of these different steps, which DECMA has been testing the most efficient and effective ways to do that, so that it's economically viable and also trying to capture the value of the material.
Yeah, and that's a particular challenge, isn't it, given that fishing gear and aquaculture gear is pretty dirty when it it's brought in typically, and it's often not going to end up in very high value outputs. So how have they been trying to actually generate value from this to make this into a sort of an economically viable business model?
Yeah, so it's definitely a big challenge, and obviously I can't really speak for Derek, but from our conversations with him, he was quite open about the fact, if he was just in this for the money, he would have maybe chosen a different kind of business to go into. And he is really driven. He came from the fishing industry. He saw what a big issue this was, and the amount of, waste being produced. So it was really a kind of passion, because he cares about the marine environment, why he was interested in doing this, and why he has really, been quite innovative in the ways that he wanted, coming up with solutions. So there's lots of different stages, as you kind of said, to pre-process the gear before it can be recycled. So washing the gear, depending on the setup, there's different processes for kind of shredding or desizing. And because of how gear is designed, it's not really designed at the moment for dismantling. So there was lots of things that Derek was talking about where it'd be a lot easier, just simple changes in the design that would make the disassembly a lot easier. So at the moment, it's kind of like what Jim was saying, where it's a very labour intensive process. They actually employ people to kind of unpick individual stitching on these huge nets, which takes hours and hours and hours. Whereas and they have to do that because there's different polymers in the nets. So they have to take out those stitching, because the stitching is of a material that can't be recycled with the rest of the net. So there's other things that could be done to, make that process easier.
Yeah, and what really struck me when I was thinking about the way they were trying to just shave every minute off the process, because it's so hard to make it economically viable to do this particular recycling process. That anything they could do that could just make it slightly quicker, reduce the labour cost that bit, was more likely to be able to make an economically viable end product. So I think, like you said, the design, if small design changes to make things easier to take apart, can make such a big difference. And in terms of sort of actually getting a brand new recycling facility off the ground and the equipment needed, what were the kind of funding options that they went for?
Yeah, so they did receive some grant funding from Marine Fund Scotland in 2024 to 2025, which they've used to invest in specialised machinery. But then other than that, it's been funded themselves. So they've done a lot of testing, as I said, to find the most kind of effective and efficient ways. So a lot of that testing was funded by themselves, and experimenting what products they could create at the end. And I think that is a big challenge as well with the fishing gear, is they are competing against plastics and other more easily recyclable material. So trying to find the kind of end market demand as well that suits the quality and the different types of quality that can come out of the process, and was something that they also have done a lot of experimentation with, and they're planning to upscale it now. I think that they've just received all of their equipment now, so they'll be upscaling anytime.
Yeah, that's probably why he wasn't able to come, because he's busy getting his new facility, new expanded facility going. But I think it's interesting that they're compared to the other two that we've spoken to. I think these are the ones that have done the most into what actually Jim was talking about, kind of producing some end products, but at Decmar they've been quite innovative in trying to come up with the final added value end products, rather than just producing kind of secondary materials that someone else could take and turn into an end product. They want to capture that value of that final product, and that's what would make it a more viable business model in the round. So I thought that was particularly interesting. Thank you. Great. Thanks, everyone. First of all, have any of you got any questions for each other based on that conversation?
I've probably got one for Charlotte, actually, if that's all right. As I said earlier, Charlotte, I was fascinated. I didn't realise there was actually a second-hand market for wind turbines. What is the kind of appetite like in the marketplace for second-hand wind turbines?
Yeah, it's a lot of it is driven by site-specific constraints. So wind turbines, like a lot of things, have got bigger and more powerful, and it's actually very difficult to buy a new small wind turbine these days. So if you are constrained by perhaps your planning consent and you can't buy a turbine new that you want, but you could buy a second-hand reconditioned one that actually meets your requirements. They are cheaper as well. So some community organisations, for example, where you're not looking at on a commercial scale for a wind farm, and they perhaps have a lower capex ability favouring them. And then there are it can be geographic as well. So, for example, Ukraine at the moment is a hotspot for putting up second-hand reconditioned wind turbines, because it's allowing them to get large numbers of wind turbines up and running without having to wait for new ones to be made. So I think the challenge will be is that at the moment, the good quality wind turbines that are reaching end of life, our numbers are quite small. So the success rate's quite high, actually. When we start to get to the point when there are hundreds and then thousands of wind turbines coming offline, the market, and a complete excess of supply versus demand. So we can't really rely on that as something that's going to persist in any great volume in the future. This is why we need to look at the model that actually sees huge parallels between what you're doing, exactly the same, component mining, trying to keep something in its highest possible utility. It's exactly the same concept.
And I find it so interesting across all of these different businesses that there were people, like companies, willing to take those risks of investing in these new methods themselves, or investing in trying to find those end markets. So it can be quite a challenging aspect of this. So I think it's fantastic to see that people see the value in investing for the long term and for the good of the environment. But it definitely would be good to kind of find more forms of sort of policy support, or perhaps better investor understanding of the longer term benefits and importance of this.
I mean, this has been a great conversation. It's been wonderful to listen along. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. So first one is from David for Charlotte. Would the business as usual metals recycling market ignore the rare earth metals in magnets and let them become contaminants in the recycled metals? Or would they adapt to recycle the magnets separately to recover the hafnium, etc.?
Yeah, I'll try and keep answer short. The short answer is that if they're present in only small quantities and we don't really know where they are, it's very, very difficult to recover. So yes, undoubtedly there's a lot of unrecovered material. You might, in a car, for example, cars are typically shredded. So it would get lost in that process and actually be a contaminant. What we are seeing is an emerging industry is geopolitically critical materials, particularly rare earths, get ever more important. There is a fast emerging industry that is actually looking at isolating and recovering these materials, and wind turbines are great candidates for those. Some types of wind turbines do have large blocks of magnets in that can be recovered. Not all, some. And the economics are still very, very difficult to recover that. Jim, I don't know if you actually, what's your thoughts on the sort of more scarce materials? You must come across that a lot in your small domestic appliances.
Yeah, we do, and it's a good point that you make, Charlotte, on the sort of critical rare earth metals. We're looking very much at sort of downstream recycling of, sending it to specialist refiners to try and recover some of that material off the back end if it's not going to be a component that's reused. But yeah, it's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, wonderful. One more question then that we have time for. So this one's for Jim from Emma, and it's around kind of the model that you guys use in terms of once you've repaired and recovered TVs. Do you sell them directly, or do you sell them via local retailers? So what's the model that you use to get them back into circulation?
Okay. Yeah, so we tend to work with sort of tried and trusted partners that we move the TVs onto. It's very difficult. I mean, we couldn't list every single TV that we've got for sale on our website, for example. But if we do occasionally sell direct to the public, so if anyone was looking for and was interested at all and they had a specific thing in mind, just email and someone will get back to them. We'd be delighted to help.
Amazing. Well, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid, today. Thank you very much to Susan and Holly from Resource Futures and to Charlotte and Jim for joining us as our expert guests today. This is it for our Urgent Conversation webinars for 2025. We'll be back in a couple of months in January with our next set of webinars. So thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to everyone who came along. Bye, everyone.